Hello, Stephanie. Welcome to the Positive Leadership Academy podcast. I'm so excited to have you here with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome. I'm very intrigued about the title of your book, and I would like to know who are the saints and the drunks and how those traditions kind of come together.
Well, it's called The Saint and the Drunk, a guide to making the big decisions of your life. And what the saint is Saint Ignatius of Loyola, who lived in the 1500s and was in the process of trying to make a big decision. He was a mercenary, he was a soldier, and he got wounded. And he was trying to decide if he wanted to go back to being a soldier or become a priest. And he used a particular set of techniques and tools to make that decision. He became a priest. Spoiler alert, founded the Jesuit order. And people kept asking him, how do you make decisions? How do you make decisions? And so he wrote it down in a set of exercises called the Spiritual Exercises of Ignatius of Loyola. And people have used it for literally centuries. I grew up Catholic, did that process, found it very useful, but then found myself working as an executive coach. And my clients would say to me, how do you make decisions? How do you make decisions? And I didn't feel comfortable rolling out a very, very Catholic process. And so I tried to think, what lens can I use? And I realized that there is a great lens built by a drunk. So Bill Wilson was one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. And early AA was very Christian. And a lot of people who were interested in recovery said, hey, I can't with the whole God thing. What about us atheists? And so the early AA people came up with this idea of like, look, we want you to have a spiritual experience so you don't die of alcoholism, but you come up with your own idea of something bigger than you. We don't care. And they called it a higher power. And I realized that taking the message of these techniques for discernment or making decisions and using that frame of like, doesn't matter what you believe, you can access an inner knowing that is useful to you, was what seemed to unlock that for my clients. I started doing it with friends. And after using these IP, for lack of a better phrase, a couple people said, why don't you write that down? You should write a book about that. So the book came out in May, and here we are.
Great. Excellent. So interesting. And yes, absolutely. And what I'm hearing from you is kind of give it to, I'm Catholic as well. So, we tend to gravitate to what we believe. And I know it's a very fine line when we are coaching someone, but kind of give it to the higher power, kind of takes that off, and individuals can kind of say, all right, well, you're not talking to me in a Christian wording approach, but you are just, in a way, you're letting people to say that, hey, let that decision be managed by a higher power.
Well, and it's also really opening the aperture of what we consider to be spiritual, right? So I had a client who was an atheist and deeply intentional about his work and giving back to the world. And he was one of the people with whom I used this work before I wrote the book. And he was really inspiring because I realized that an intention can be a frame, right? For someone who has no spiritual practice or spiritual beliefs, a calling, a sense of vocation, right? Like a lot of times we think of the word vocation to reference a specific, like a religious calling or a vocation to some, like I'm called to be a doctor. But I believe you can have a vocation to be anything. You can have a vocation to be a parent, a caregiver, a spouse, a teacher. And if you feel that calling for yourself, that too can be a guide. And so the idea was to say, look, we have a lot of things that we can connect with to guide us. Let's not get caught up on language around spirituality. Let's just open it up as wide as we can. And it seems to be helpful to people.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Tell me more about the genius of the body, and how can leaders rely on logic and kind of data and start listening to that?
Well, there's a number of different techniques that I talk about in the book. And one of them I call the genius of the body, or some people refer to it as somatic wisdom. And the idea is that we know things in our body. And the challenge is that culturally, we are taught to privilege intellectual binary frameworks. pros and cons, something rational, which can work with many decisions. But with large decisions, particularly around career or a major life change, that intellectual framework isn't enough. And so the idea is, what tools can you use to access something that is more embodied? And the
Mm,
idea of the genius of the body is just to see what is in your body. Right. And I do want to say before I describe this that for some people, this isn't an avenue that is useful to them. I find that people with chronic pain, maybe a history of trauma or assault, the genius of the body is not going to be an avenue for you. And that's okay because there's others. But for those of you that are curious about exploring the genius of the body, I would invite you to try doing some exercise that is physically comfortable to you without any distractions. Take a walk with no headphones, leave your phone on the kitchen counter, and see what comes up. Is there some part of your body that feels tight? What's in there?
mm,
Get curious about it. For some people, it helps to pay attention to your senses. Like, have a day that's all about taste and eat
mm,
and drink your favorite things. See what comes up for you. For me, a lot of emotions will come up when I exercise. I'm a swimmer. And sometimes I get into the pool in one mood, I get out of the pool and I'm in a completely different frame of reference. And I try to just be open to what is unfolding. And if you think about it, our language is very connected to the genius of the body. We talk about having cold feet or butterflies in our stomach
yes.
or a broken heart. We are languaging the ways in which we do sense things in our body. And what I'm trying to do is just remind people that this is an avenue that exists. All of us are walking around in bodies. And for many of us, it can be a real useful way to understand more about what we want.
Yes. And you mentioned at the beginning, obviously, if you have suffered traumatic experiences, to be mindful with this exercise. So tell me more about that.
Well,
I'm curious to know.
one of the things that I talk about in the book is the idea of honoring resistance. Too
Mm,
often we are told, no pain, no gain, push
mm,
through. And
exactly.
I say, no, no, stop. I totally disagree with that. If you feel resistance, honor it. If something doesn't feel right for you, honor it. I was recently talking to a friend who bought my book. And in the book, I say, read this as you want to. Put it away for months and then come back to it. And she did exactly that. And giving yourself permission to say, right now, this doesn't feel right to me is important. And so for someone who feels a resistance to a more somatic body based exercise, I would say honor that. And let's look at another exercise. Another exercise that doesn't have to be body based is paying attention to attraction and aversion.
Mm,
So we, again, as a culture, we really like the positive. So we like
exactly.
attraction. I fell in love with this place. I'm so drawn to this job. I think most of us understand the value of attraction and making a decision. What we don't pay attention to is aversion. That feeling of, oh my God, this isn't for me. Like walking into a new apartment that you're thinking of renting and just having a bad feeling,
Mm,
that's aversion. And it
yes.
can be really useful. And I think opening ourselves up to both. So if I am coaching a woman who is trying to decide what she wants to do in retirement, and she tells me that the last 5 books and movies she consumed were about a woman moving to Italy and buying a villa, I will suggest that she is attracted to content about going to Europe. Maybe she should take a trip, right? The aversion can be the same thing. And the example that I use when I take groups through this in a retreat is I talk about a young woman who is trying to discern whether or not to have a baby. And she goes to visit her sister who has just had a
Mhm.
baby. And everybody knows the positive side of that, the attraction side of that. But I said, what about a woman who walks in and thinks, oh my God, I can't believe my sister had a C-section. Like they cut her open. Like, I feel so afraid holding this tiny infant. It feels overwhelming and scary to me. If that woman honors her like negative energy, that could be a really useful guidance to her that no, she does not want to have a child, at least not at this moment. And if she flees her sister's house, puts on her running shoes and runs for 5 miles, really reclaiming her kind of like agency over her body, that is really useful information that she's never going to get from a pro and con list.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And I resonate what you're saying in regards to the resistance, right? I personally I'm a trauma survivor, so I have what is called complex PTSD. I find out that later in my life, the triggers that kind of shaped my life, and I didn't realize that I was getting triggered. And I realize in business, especially in my career, I will be very resilient person, but I will really push the envelope to the limit. And if people did not accept my business idea, or I was in sales back then, it will trigger that self judgment like, okay, well, you're not doing things right. You're not doing this. You're not doing that. Maybe you should be doing that. Maybe you got to accelerate in that. And that trigger a lot of hyper achiever approach. And now I realize that, like you say, trusting, yes, if there's resistance, there's some point where it's not like you quitting, but you like, okay, well, it's like I'm really pushing a brick wall here. I'm not going to get through it. So might as well just kind of flow with something that is going to flow naturally instead of pushing it, and really pay attention to those triggers that can come your way as well from past experiences as well.
You also mentioned something that is another concept that I explore, that where I call it an inner community.
Hmm.
And there are lots of different sort of therapeutic techniques, including internal family systems, that talk about inner voices. This is not internal family systems. What it is it's a way of picturing the different. If you think about your internal community as like a church gathering or a,
Hmm.
like sewing circle, these are people who you are interacting with in community. Some you like, some you don't like, and realizing that each one of them exists, and some of them are supportive and some of them are not. And sometimes just stepping out and understanding that's my unhelpful aunt's voice and I
Uh-huh.
don't need to listen to her
Yeah.
anymore. Thank you. And that can be really useful. The other thing is I have the whole middle part of the book is about the narratives that we carry, sometimes from our family, sometimes from our culture, and really inviting people to look at their narratives and see if they still support them or if they're limiting. So a lot of times we will approach something as if it is true rather than stopping and saying, but is it true? It was true for me before. Is it still true? And
Yeah.
then looking especially at what you are told, what you're told by your culture. Right. And
Hmm.
so, and stories can both support us and limit us. Right. And I look at the ones that come up most in my work with people in this subjects, and it's usually things like money, who takes care of the family, when do you get to leave? I have a whole chapter on quitting, like when is it quitting and when is it
Hmm.
evolving? So there's like nine different narratives. And to give you an example, so I am the grandchild of immigrants. My grandparents came here from Italy on a boat. And so I was very much influenced by the immigrant mentality. Like, you're going to do really well in school, you're going to work really hard, you're going to build a better life for your children. And there was a positive side to that. I have been successful, I have worked hard, I have a great work ethic. And there's a negative side to that, which is I tend to be a bit of a workaholic. I don't take vacations. I have, often had multiple jobs. And the idea is to understand this is not something, this is optional. I can look at it and say, what are the stories that I was told about work? Right. And are they helpful and are they valid and are they supportive? And to really do that sort of internal work.
Yes, absolutely. I come from a family that if you were sitting in the sofa, that means you're not doing anything. So you'd better get up and do something. That it took forever for me to really enjoy a vacation and just relax. Yes, because in the back of my head, I had my dad saying, "What are you doing? Why are you sitting down? Do something. Do something." And that it was the programming that I needed to let go. And I was also a workaholic to the point that, hey, if I can work 12 hours, 12 hours, it is. So it was kind of interesting. Interesting. You talk about your relationship with the sister of Son Joseph of Peace. And I'm interested to know how it helped you shape and coaching women leaders.
Well, so I am a member of the community of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace. We have three different areas. We're in New Jersey and Washington State, and then in London and England. And so it's a very old community of pretty radical nuns that work towards social justice. I am not a nun. I am what's called an associate. And we basically say, hey, we want to go do your radical social justice thing. And we gather in community. And I think
Mm,
what's valuable for me, I actually think it is equally valuable for me as a writer, a speaker, and a coach in that I am answerable to a community of women who know a lot more than me. And
mm,
one of the things that I think is challenging, whether you're a leader or a thought leader, or, and people put my book in the self-help section of the bookstore, right?
mhm,
And I think that we need community to keep us humble and to
mm,
keep us in check, right? So I have I mean, I have people in my family who are happy to keep me in check, but I am in a community where I am always learning, and these nuns know a lot more than me about everything. And I do
mhm,
think it is important for us to be accountable to someone who knows more than we do to keep us in right relationship, right? Because it is easy. I mean, I'm sure you have the same experience. I basically get paid to help people decide, right? And often people will turn to me for advice or suggestions or framings. I was in executive leadership. If you're the boss long enough, sometimes you come home and you forget that you're not the boss at home. Right. Or you go to your community and you try to be like, I'm in charge here. And I think it's important. And maybe it's just for people like me. And there are people who can navigate that just fine. But I think it's useful to be in community in a way where you are accountable. And I also think that being in community develops muscles that we don't get as much. A lot of us do our interactions over a screen. We
mhm,
are spending less time, and community being could be a bowling alley, it could be a religious community, it could be a, group of volunteers that clean up trash by the beach. But being in person with actual human beings, some of whom you like and some of whom you don't, builds a sort of skill and muscle memory that we don't always get to use anymore. And so I think it's useful for us to make sure that no matter what we're doing in our career, we are tapped into those opportunities to just be another one of the group and ideally always learning from the rest of the group.
exactly. And it's so amazing the way you describe it is when I'm in community, there is so much that you receive and so much that you give. And at the same time, you'd be surprised how many people are paying attention to you, right? So like you say, that accountability, that responsibility to be a good citizen is very important because believe it or not, people are paying attention to you as you're paying attention to them. And you can create what I call magical moments for those individuals because, like I said, we all fighting our own battles. You don't know what that person is going through, especially in communities where people don't disclose what they do for a living. Right? They're just there for the sense of community.
Also, understanding, I mean, it is also important to realize that community is also difficult. There's an emotional weightlifting aspect of going to community with someone who drives you crazy.
Hmm.
But they're in your community and you have to learn how to work around their, "Oh my goodness, she's telling that story again." Like those types of dynamics. And, in any kind of work environment, we need to deal with people who are very different. And I think that being in community can, like you said, give you compassion that,
Hmm.
you maybe find out somebody else's story, right? Or you understand, wow, that community is being impacted in a really different way than my community is in the current political situation, right? Like just that sense of the layers of our experience often comes out to us more readily in community.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm gonna go back to the first section of our podcast, the question about decision making. I talk to a lot of leaders. It's funny, as I'm pretty sure you as a coach, they don't book a session for you to celebrate how well their life is going. And right.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So I talk to a lot of leaders that they feel stuck, right? They feel stuck in their career, they feel stuck in their I talk to a lot of I don't believe in middle age. I believe that you can either optimize yourself or decide to go the other route. But what for a leader that it feels stuck, right? and they need to make a decision, how would you help them move intentionally into, obviously they all want to make the right decision, and it's so hard to make the right decision because I don't think you will ever make the right decision. You just make a decision that leads to another one. But how would you help them moving forward
I
within?
mean, I mean, of course, I would tell them to buy my book because I wrote a whole book about that. But
Absolutely, that's number one.
the second thing, I would really invite them to get curious about a couple of things. So one is when I do this in a retreat, like I did a retreat and it was mostly women, as happens, and there were a couple of men. And I said, "What do you want?" Like just want. I just want to know what do you want? Not what's practical. What do you want? And that was really, it was sort of, they were a little nervous about saying, wait, you mean I just get to say what I want? So the first thing I would try to do is put aside all the practicalities. What do you want? Do you want the CEO job or not? Do you want this thing? Like, just what's your gut? What's your heart telling you if you can access that? So that's the first thing. What do you want? Let's privilege that. The second is, what narratives do you have around this decision process, right? When someone says they're stuck, often it's because they have a narrative in their mind that a decision should be quick
Mm,
and decisive and without any sort of regrets. Well, that's not how decisions generally get made. Real deep decisions about major things in your life take a long time. I have done this discernment process on things that have taken me months and months, sometimes like close to a year. That's not unusual. So is stuck just mean that you think it should happen in 3 days after you do a pros and cons list? And is that realistic? And then I think also there is something to be said for the winter, right? So I live in Seattle. It rains for 5 or 6 months. Occasionally we get snow. And it seems as if nothing is happening. But as soon as the spring comes, everything starts blooming,
mm,
everything starts growing. It was necessary to have that rest. And so for a lot of people, when they feel stuck, they're actually in a kind of winter. They are not ready to move. They are
mm.
assessing, they are recharging, they're metabolizing, they're considering. And a lot of times they'll wake up and be like, now I know, now I'm ready to move forward. And so it does come back to that, not just honoring resistance, but honoring the season that you find yourself in and trusting if you are not ready to make a decision, let's reframe the narrative. Don't say you're stuck,
Yeah,
say you're waiting for an understanding. Don't say that you're not following something. This is your life. If you need to take a minute and honor your process, then honor your process. And if it helps you to think about analogies like winter or the seasons or nature or whatever, everything experiences cycles, including our life. And it's okay to have a cycle where you don't know. That liminal space in between things can often be really rich when we're done with it. It's really often uncomfortable when we're in it.
exactly. Exactly. That's well done there. Great. Where can people find you? Is your book in Amazon and all the
Yeah,
e-tailers
books in
out there?
Amazon and Barnes and Noble. If you are listening to this from Europe, it's published by Shepherd Walwyn in London, and you can buy it directly from them. I have an audio book, and which I voiced actually, and found out that I wrote a book about decision making and have trouble saying the word decision. My poor audio editor was like, "What are you doing?" I have a website that has all things Stephanie.
Yes, I will put everything on the show notes.
I do personal coaching and professional executive coaching. And I'm going to be offering some classes and other kind of coursework. And then the last thing is on Substack, I have a weekly newsletter called Fierce Grace. And then I also have a podcast that I do with an old friend called The Bad Boss Brief, where we talk about bad bosses.
Oh, great. Yeah, I definitely should give you some pointers on that or some stories as well.
That would be
I
great.
had
That'd
really
be
bad
great.
yes, I have stories that, God, if HR was with me, I'd probably be a billionaire and, create a lot of lawsuits for the people that
Well, it's always good to explore ways in which we
Yes,
can grow and change, and that's really the goal there. So yeah, you can
yeah.
find me in any of those places.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you for sharing a lot of a lot of wisdom, a lot of techniques, and I think it's a good segue for people to purchase your book.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me, Javier. Goodbye.